The rain came down in sheets, a cold, gray curtain that turned the world to mud and misery. Eli squinted against the wind, pulling the brim of his hat lower as his horse, Gideon, picked its way cautiously along the swollen riverbank. He had been checking the fences along the north pasture, a fool's errand in this weather, but staying cooped up in his cabin felt worse. The solitude he usually cherished had started to feel like a cage, and the storm was a welcome distraction, a fury that matched the restlessness in his own soul. The river was a churning beast of brown water, carrying with it the debris of the high country, branches, clumps of earth, and the occasional unlucky jackrabbit. It was the color of the water that first caught his eye, a faint, unnatural stain of red that swirled near the bank before being devoured by the current. He pulled Gideon to a halt, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle in its scabbard, a habit born of years spent in a land that was rarely kind. He saw her then, a heap of soaked calico and pale skin tangled in the roots of a half-submerged cottonwood. For a moment, he thought she was a washed-out deer, but then a slender, bare foot shifted with the pull of the water. He swore under his breath and swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking into the grasping mud. She was unconscious, her face turned to the side, cheek pressed into the cold, wet earth. Her dress, what was left of it, was torn from shoulder to waist, and the fabric was dark with a mixture of river water and blood. A long, ugly gash ran across her forehead, matting her dark hair with crimson. Her feet were bare, scraped raw and blue with cold. She was not a big woman, but she looked impossibly small and broken against the raw power of the landscape. Eli knelt, his knee sinking into the mire. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck, searching for the faint, thready beat of life. He found it, weak but stubborn. He did not know her. She was not from any of the neighboring ranches, and he would have remembered a face like hers, even one as battered and pale as this. There was a fineness to her bones, a delicacy that seemed out of place in this hard country. He looked around, scanning the opposite bank, the tree line, the empty horizon. There was no one, no tracks that had not already been erased by the relentless downpour. She was alone, dropped here by a cruel fate or a crueler hand. It did not matter which. Leaving her was not an option. With a grunt, he gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his chest. She did not stir, did not make a sound, her head lolling against his shoulder. Her skin was like ice. He carried her back to Gideon, who snorted nervously at the strange, still burden. It took some doing, but he managed to get her situated in front of him on the saddle, her limp body held fast against his. He wrapped the edges of his oilskin slicker around her as best he could and urged the horse onward, away from the roaring river and toward the distant, smoky promise of his homestead. The ride was slow and grim. The woman remained utterly still, her breathing so shallow he had to stop twice to make sure it was still there. He could feel the cold seeping from her body into his own, a damp chill that had nothing to do with the rain. He lived a life of deliberate isolation, had carved out a piece of this unforgiving land for himself because he preferred the company of horses and cattle to that of men. The presence of this silent, broken woman was an intrusion, a complication he had not asked for. Yet, as he held her, a strange and unwelcome sense of protectiveness settled over him. She was a piece of driftwood caught in his current, and, for now, at least, she was his to keep from sinking. His cabin was little more than a single room, built of sturdy pine logs he had felled and stripped himself. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a rope bed another. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs sat in the center. It was a place of function, not comfort, a fortress against the wilderness and his own memories. He laid her gently on his bed, the straw-stuffed mattress rustling beneath her weight. Her wet clothes were a ruin, and he knew he had to get them off her, but he hesitated. For now. He covered her with a thick wool blanket and set about building up the fire. Soon, the flames were leaping in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering light across the room and pushing back the encroaching gloom of the storm. He filled a kettle with water and hung it over the fire, then went to his small store of medical supplies, a bottle of carbolic acid, clean linen for bandages, and a jar of salve. As he worked, he could not stop glancing at the still figure on the bed. She had not moved. Her eyes were closed, her face as blank and pale as fresh snow. There was no sign of a dream, no twitch of a muscle, just a profound and terrifying stillness. It was the silence that unnerved him most, not the quiet he was used to, which was filled with the familiar sounds of the wind, the crackle of the fire, the soft stamp of his horse in the lean-to. This was a different kind of silence. It emanated from her, an emptiness so absolute it seemed to swallow the other sounds in the room. She did not moan in her sleep. She did not shiver from the cold. When he finally found the courage to carefully cut away the sodden remnants of her dress, exposing the bruised and lacerated skin beneath, she did not flinch. He worked methodically, cleaning the cuts on her arms and legs, daubing them with antiseptic that should have made her cry out. Nothing. He found a long, clean nightshirt of his own and managed to get her into it. It was absurdly large on her, the sleeves swallowing her hands, the hem pooling around her ankles. As he covered her again with the blankets, her eyelids fluttered open. Her eyes were a startling shade of blue, the color of a winter sky, and they were utterly vacant. They did not focus on him or on the room. They stared past him, at the rough log wall, as if seeing something he could not. There was no fear in them, no confusion, no pain. There was nothing. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers who had witnessed too much horror, in animals caught in traps, waiting for the end. It was the look of a spirit that had retreated so far inside itself that it had lost the way back. She did not cry. She did not speak. She just stared. And in the oppressive silence of the cabin, with the storm raging outside, Eli was haunted by the woman who was not there. The wall she stared at was made of wood and mud, but in her mind, it was the floral paper of her bedroom, the paper she had stared at for hours, for days, for years, while her husband, Thomas, slept off his liquor in the chair beside the bed. The memory was not a story with a beginning and an end. It was a feeling, a thick, suffocating dread that had been the texture of her life for so long she could not remember anything else. Her escape had not been a plan. It had been a breaking point. Thomas had come home late, smelling of cheap whiskey and the cloying perfume of a saloon girl. He had been in one of his dark moods, the kind that began with a sneer and ended with the back of his hand. He had found fault with the dinner, with the way the fire was banked, with the silence in which she met his tirades. He had enjoyed her fear, savored her pleading. It was a currency he used to prove his own worth. That night, he had been worse than usual. He had held up the lantern, its light making his face a grotesque mask of shadows, and he had detailed all the ways she was a disappointment. A barren wife, a plain face, a dull mind. His words were stones, each one striking a bruise deeper than any fist could make. She had endured it, as she always did, by retreating to that silent place inside herself. But then he had grabbed the small, hand-carved bird her father had given her, the only beautiful thing she owned, and he had tossed it into the fire. "No room for pretty things here," he had slurred, watching the delicate wooden wings blacken and curl into ash. Something inside her snapped. It was not a roar of anger, but a quiet, clean break. While he laughed, she had walked past him, out the back door, and into the night. She had not taken a coat or shoes. She had simply walked away from the house, from the life that was suffocating her, and she had started to run. She ran until her lungs burned and her feet were bleeding, until the sounds of his shouting faded behind her. She did not know how he had died. She had only heard the whispers days later, when she had crept back to the edge of town, desperate for water. They found him at the bottom of the old well, his neck broken. The sheriff had ruled it an accident. Thomas was drunk. It was dark. He must have stumbled, but the town had its own verdict. They looked at her, the runaway wife who reappeared just as her husband met his end, and they saw a killer. The whispers followed her everywhere. Doors that were once open were now shut. Faces that once smiled now turned away in suspicion. The women called her a harlot. The men looked at her with a mixture of fear and a strange, hungry curiosity. She was alone, branded by a crime she did not commit, but one that everyone believed she was capable of. The scorn was a prison as real as any jailhouse. And she had run from that, too, into the wilderness, into the storm, until her body finally gave out by the river's edge. A loud crack of thunder, so close it shook the very foundations of the cabin, finally broke through the fog of her memory. Her eyes flew open, and this time she saw the log walls, the strange masculine room, the fire, and she saw the man. He was sitting in a chair across the room, watching her. He was large, broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by a dark beard. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her numbness. It was a familiar feeling, the only one that had felt real for years. She scrambled backward on the bed, a choked gasp escaping her throat, her body hitting the wall with a thud. Her mind screamed. Another man, another room, another trap. He stood up slowly, holding his hands out, palms open, as if to show he held no weapon. His movements were deliberate, unthreatening. "Easy now," he said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel, but there was no malice in it. "You're safe here. The storm's a bad one. I found you by the river." She stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He took a hesitant step closer. She flinched, pulling the blanket up to her chin like a shield. "I mean you no harm," he repeated, his voice gentle. He stopped, keeping his distance. "You've been hurt. I need to tend to your wounds, but I will not touch you again unless you allow it." Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape that did not exist. The door was barred against the storm. The single window showed nothing but a swirling vortex of rain and darkness. She was trapped. Again. Her breathing grew shallow, coming in ragged, painful bursts. The man, Eli, watched her, his expression a mixture of pity and frustration. He could see the terror in her eyes, and he understood its source, if not its specifics. "There's broth on the hearth," he said, changing the subject. "You need to eat something." She shook her head, a small, violent motion. Her gaze fell to her body, hidden beneath the blanket and the large nightshirt. She could feel the dull, throbbing ache of her injuries, the deep cuts and the blossoming bruises. Some of them were from her flight through the woods, but others were older, souvenirs from her husband. She resisted the idea of treatment, especially for the wounds hidden beneath the borrowed shirt. To be tended to was to be touched. To be touched was to be vulnerable. To be vulnerable was to be in pain. It was a simple, brutal equation she had learned by heart. But the gash on her forehead was beginning to throb with a fiery intensity, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. The room tilted, the firelight blurring into a smear of orange. She swayed, and Eli moved forward instinctively, catching her before she could fall back against the wall. His hands were firm on her shoulders, his touch surprisingly steady. For a moment, she was too weak to resist. He helped her sit up, propping pillows behind her back. "I have to clean that cut on your head," he said softly, his face close to hers. "It's deep. It will fester if I do not." She looked at him, truly looked at him. For the first time, his eyes were dark and serious. There was no cruelty in them, no cunning, none of the dark pleasure she had seen so often in Thomas's gaze. There was just a quiet resolve. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his hands surprisingly gentle for their size. He cleaned the wound on her forehead, his touch light. She flinched when the antiseptic stung, but she did not pull away. When he was done, He looked at the other visible injuries, the long scratches on her arms, the deep bruise on her cheek. "There are others," he stated, his voice flat. It was not a question. He had seen them when he had removed her wet dress, the dark, ugly marks on her ribs, the cut on her thigh that was still sluggishly bleeding, staining the clean nightshirt. "I need to see to them." Her body went rigid. She clutched the blanket tighter, shaking her head again, more forcefully this time. The terror was back, sharp and overwhelming. To let him see those marks felt like a deeper violation than the blows that had caused them. They were her shame, the secret map of her humiliation. "Please," he said, his voice dropping lower. "The cloth is sticking to the wound on your leg. It needs cleaning." They sat in a stalemate. The only sounds, the howl of the wind and the crackle of the fire. He did not push, did not demand. He simply waited, his patience a tangible thing in the small room. She felt a tear, hot and stinging, slide down her cheek. It was the first she had shed. The sight of it seemed to decide something for her. Slowly, her fingers loosened their grip on the blanket. She let it fall, her gaze fixed on the wall beyond him. She would not look at him. She would not look at her own broken body. She would go back to that empty place inside, where nothing could touch her. But as he reached for the hem of the nightshirt, a sound, thin and reedy, escaped her lips. It was her own voice, rusty from disuse. "Don't look away." The words were barely a whisper, but they stopped him cold. He looked up from his task, his eyes finding hers. She was looking at him now, her gaze direct and filled with a desperate, defiant plea. It was not a request for him to turn his eyes from her body, but the opposite. It was a demand to be seen, all of it, the pain, the shame, the person beneath the injuries. She was daring him to look at the truth of her and not flinch. Eli held her gaze. He had seen his share of ugliness in the world, but the raw vulnerability in her eyes was more unsettling than any wound. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I will not," he promised. He lifted the hem of the shirt, his movements slow and careful. He exposed the gash on her thigh, the angry red skin around it, the fabric of the shirt already dark with fresh blood. He worked in silence, his focus entirely on the task. He cleaned the wound with warm water, his touch methodical and impersonal, yet profoundly gentle. He applied the salve and wrapped it with a clean linen bandage. He did the same for the bruises on her ribs, his fingers brushing against her skin with a clinical detachment that was, in its own way, a profound form of respect. Throughout it all, he did not look away. His eyes met hers whenever she dared to look at him. He saw the pain she refused to voice, the shame she fought to conceal. He saw the flicker of courage in their depths. He was not a doctor, just a rancher who knew how to stitch up a cow or set a horse's broken leg. But he treated her with a focused reverence, as if he were mending something precious. He was not treating a collection of wounds. He was tending to a person, and she knew it. When he was finished, he pulled the nightshirt back down and covered her with the blanket. The air in the room was thick with unspoken emotion. Nothing had happened between them, not in the way the world measured such things. But an intimacy had been forged in that silence, a connection so potent it left them both feeling raw and exposed. He stood up and retreated to the other side of the room, turning his back to her as he busied himself with the fire. She lay on the bed, her body aching, her spirit shaken, feeling the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being cared for without cost. Several days passed. The storm outside eventually broke, giving way to a world washed clean, dripping and gray. The woman on the bed slowly began to mend. The first day, she only drank the broth Eli left by her bed. The next, she ate a few bites of bread. She still did not speak, but the blankness in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a watchful, cautious awareness. On the third day, as he was heading out to tend to his stock, she spoke her second sentence. "My name is Clara." He stopped at the door and turned. "Eli," he replied. He waited, but she said nothing more, so he nodded and left. From then on, a fragile routine was established. He would rise before dawn, make coffee, and leave a plate of food on the table for her before going out to do his chores. She would wait until he was gone before she emerged from the bed, moving stiffly around the small cabin. When he returned, she would be back under the blankets, the plate empty. She began to flinch less when he entered the room. She started to eat more, but a wide, unspoken gulf remained between them. He kept his distance, sleeping on a pile of furs by the fire, giving her the illusion of privacy in the small space. But he watched her. He saw her from the corner of his eye as he mended a bridle. Her small, pale face turned toward the window. He watched her when he came back from the barn, catching a glimpse of her standing by the fire before she scurried back to the safety of the bed. The world outside the cabin was a mirror of her inner state. The endless sky was a canvas of bruised purples and grays. The wind was a constant, mournful cry across the barren ridges. The ground was a sea of mud, sucking at Eli's boots, making every step an effort. Everything was torn, cold, and cracked. Just like her, he could see the landscape of her suffering in the way she held herself, in the shadows that still lingered deep in her eyes. One night, long after she had fallen into a quiet, exhausted sleep, Eli sat on the rough porch of his cabin, a tin cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. The moon was a sliver of bone in the inky sky. The air was sharp and clean. He looked back at the closed door of the cabin, at the faint line of light that seeped from beneath it. Inside was a woman he did not know, a woman who had brought with her a world of pain and trouble. Part of him, the sensible, solitary part that had built this life for himself, wanted her gone. He wanted his quiet, uncomplicated existence back. But another part of him, a part he did not understand, was disturbed by that thought. Her presence in his house had become a strange sort of anchor. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with her breathing. The room was no longer just a shelter. It was a place where something was healing. He felt both comforted and unsettled by her being there, by the quiet weight of her life resting temporarily in his hands. He did not know if he wanted her to leave or if he wanted her to stay. He took a sip of his cold coffee and stared out at the dark, empty land. A man caught in a storm that had nothing to do with the weather. The silence in the cabin began to wear on Eli more than the solitude ever had. It had been over a week since he'd brought Clara back from the river, and while her body was slowly mending, her spirit remained locked away. The gash on her forehead was healing into a thin, pink line. The bruises on her face were fading from a violent purple to a mottled yellow-green. She ate the food he prepared and drank the water he drew. But she moved like a ghost, a wraith of a woman haunting the edges of his small existence. He would leave in the mornings to find she had already risen, the bed made with a neatness that seemed out of place in his rough-hewn home. She would sit in the chair by the window, not looking out, but simply facing the light, her hands folded in her lap, still and silent. He found himself speaking to fill the void, his voice sounding loud and clumsy as he announced he was going to check the fences or muck out the lean-to. She would sometimes give a small, jerky nod in response, but never a word. One morning, he came back inside to find her on her feet, a broom in her hand, awkwardly sweeping the dirt floor. She was clumsy, her movement stiff and pained. Every sweep of the broom sent a small tremor through her body, and he could see her bite her lip to keep from crying out. "You should be resting," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. She did not look at him, her focus entirely on the dust motes dancing in the sliver of sunlight from the open door. She kept sweeping. "Clara, stop that. You will hurt yourself." She stopped, but not to obey him. She rested her hands on the top of the broom handle, her knuckles white. She was breathing heavily, a flush of color rising in her pale cheeks. It was the most life he had seen in her. "I am not an invalid," she said, her voice a low, raspy whisper. "You are not well," he countered. taking a step toward her. "Give me the broom." "No." The word was so quiet, yet so firm. It stopped him. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw. This was not about cleaning the floor. This was about reclaiming some small piece of herself. He sighed and backed away, leaving her to her task. From then on, it became a battle of wills. She insisted on helping. She tried to knead dough for bread, her arms trembling with the effort until she had to sit down, her face beaded with sweat. She tried to mend one of his shirts, but her fingers were clumsy and the needlework was a mess of tangled thread. She was slow. She was inefficient, and her determination was painful to watch. Eli found himself hovering, a reluctant guardian, torn between the urge to help her and the knowledge that his help was the last thing she wanted. He was trying to protect her from her own injuries, but she was fighting to prove that those injuries had not defeated her. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. He was bringing in 2 heavy pails of milk, and he saw her attempting to scrub the large cast-iron skillet at the wash basin. She was struggling to lift it with one hand while scrubbing with the other, her face a mask of concentration and pain. "Leave it," he said, setting the pails down with a thud. "I will do it." She ignored him. "Clara, you will pull your stitches." He moved behind her, reaching for the pan. "Give it to me." His hand brushed hers as he tried to take it from her. A jolt went through her, and she recoiled as if burned. The frustration, the pain, the shame of her own weakness, it all boiled over in a single, explosive moment. With a choked cry, she wrenched the heavy skillet from his grasp and hurled it. It was not aimed at his head, but at the space beside him. It hit the floor with a deafening clang, skittering across the wooden planks before coming to rest by the hearth. The cabin fell silent. Gideon stamped his foot in the lean-to, startled by the noise. Clara stood frozen, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with shock at her own actions. Eli stared at the pan, then at her. He saw the fear in her eyes, the immediate regret, the expectation of a blow. He had seen that look on his own mother's face 1,000 times. Something inside him, a knot of tension he hadn't realized he was carrying, finally loosened. He let out a short, surprised bark of a laugh. It was a rusty, unused sound. Clara stared at him, her fear slowly being replaced by confusion. A small, uncertain tremor touched the corner of her own mouth. He laughed again, a little louder this time, and the sight of this large, serious man chuckling at a skillet on the floor was so absurd that she felt a bubble of laughter escape her own throat. It was an awkward, breathless sound, but it was real. They stood there for a long moment, 2 strangers in a small cabin, sharing their first fragile smile over an act of sudden violence. The air between them had changed. A few days later, their supplies were running low. The small town of Redemption was a half-day's ride away, and he could not put the trip off any longer. He also could not leave her alone. "I need to ride into town," he announced over breakfast. "You will come with me." She looked up from her plate, a flicker of panic in her eyes. "I can stay." "No," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It is not safe." He did not elaborate, and she did not ask. She knew what he meant. The world was not a safe place for a woman alone. She had learned that lesson all too well. The ride to Redemption was tense. He had her ride Gideon while he walked alongside, leading the horse. She sat stiffly in the saddle, her eyes fixed on the horizon, avoiding the sight of the town as it slowly grew larger. Redemption was little more than a single dusty street lined with a dozen wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a church whose steeple leaned a little to the left. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and secrets had a short lifespan. Clara felt 100 eyes on her as they made their way to the general store. She pulled the brim of the old hat Eli had given her lower, wishing she could disappear. Inside, the store smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dried apples. Eli handed her a list. "Get these things," he said quietly. "I will settle up with Mr. Abernathy." She took the list, grateful for the task. It gave her something to focus on other than the curious stares of the other customers. As she gathered flour and sugar, she could hear the low murmur of conversation from the front of the store. Two women, their faces pinched with piety, were speaking to a friend near the bolt of calico. Their voices were low, but in the quiet store, their words carried. "That's her," one of them whispered, a venomous hiss. "The one whose husband fell in the well. A convenient accident, if you ask me." "Look at her," the other added. "Hiding her face. Shameless is what it is. Taking up with that grim man from the hills. She is the whore who killed her man." Clara froze, her hand hovering over a sack of beans. The words were like stones, striking the same bruises her husband's fists once had. She felt the blood drain from her face. She risked a glance toward the counter. Eli was standing there, his back to her, but she saw his shoulders stiffen. He had heard. His whole body went rigid, his hand clenching into a fist on the wooden countertop. Mr. Abernathy, the portly storekeeper, cleared his throat nervously. For a heartbeat, Clara thought he would turn, that he would say something, that he would defend her. She saw the muscle in his jaw jump, but he did nothing. He finished his transaction, his movements clipped and precise. He did not look at the women. He did not look at her. He simply gathered their supplies and said, "Let's go." The ride back to the ranch was shrouded in a heavy, suffocating silence. Clara felt the whispers chasing her, felt the weight of Eli's inaction like a physical burden. He had heard them call her a whore, a killer, and he had remained silent. The small, fragile trust that had begun to grow between them withered under the harsh sun of his silence. In his silence, she heard agreement. She heard judgment. That night, the tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. He built up the fire, and she prepared a simple meal of beans and bacon. They ate without speaking, the clink of their spoons against the tin plates unnaturally loud. After they had finished, she could not bear it any longer. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. He looked up, surprised by the sudden movement. He saw the fury in her eyes, a blazing fire that burned away all traces of the timid, broken woman he had found by the river. "Why?" she demanded, her voice shaking with rage. "Why did you say nothing?" He knew immediately what she meant. He looked down at his hands. "It was not my place." "Not your place?" she cried, her voice rising. "They called me a murderer, a whore, and you stood there and let them. You think it is true, do not you? You look at me and you see the same thing they do." Her hands were clenched at her sides. "You think I wanted that life? You think I enjoyed being his punching bag, his property? You think I was happy?" "No," he said, his voice low. "Of course not." "Then why did you not speak for me?" "Because talk is cheap in that town," he said, finally meeting her gaze. His own eyes were dark with a pain she did not understand. "My words would have only made it worse for you, made them talk more." "Or maybe you were afraid they would start talking about you," she shot back, her words sharp and cruel. The grim man from the hills, taking in a stray, a killer and his whore, a fine pair. The color drained from his face. He stood up, his tall frame seeming to suck the air from the room. For a terrifying moment, she thought he would strike her. She flinched, taking a step back, a lifetime of instinct taking over. The sight of her fear broke him. The anger in his face crumbled, replaced by a deep, weary anguish. He sank back into his chair and buried his face in his hands. "I am sorry," he mumbled into his palms. "Clara, I am so sorry." She watched him, her own anger faltering in the face of his raw despair. He looked up, and his face was a wreck of guilt and old sorrow. "It is not that I believe them," he said, his voice ragged. "It is. I know what men are capable of, the things they do to people they claim to love. He took a deep, shuddering breath. My father. He was a hard man. Drank too much. He had a heavy hand. And my mother was usually on the receiving end of it. I would lie in my bed at night and listen to her crying. I swore when I was big enough, I would stop him. He stared at the fire, his eyes seeing a different time, a different room. One night, he was worse than usual. I was 16. I could not listen to it anymore. I went in there, and I stopped him. He paused, the silence stretching. I retaliated too hard. He never laid a hand on her again. But the look on her face when she saw what I had done, she looked at me with the same fear she had always shown him. He shook his head slowly. I left the next day. I have not been back since. I learned that night that violence just begets more violence. My words in that store, they would have been a different kind of fist, but a fist just the same. And I will not raise a hand for any reason, ever again. Clara sank back into her own chair, her anger dissolving into a wave of stunning empathy. The chasm between them had closed, bridged by the shared, ugly knowledge of family violence. His silence had not been judgment. It had been a scar. The confession hung in the air between them, and in its wake, the truth came more easily. She began to speak, her voice quiet at first, then stronger as the words poured out. She told him about Thomas, not about the beatings. Eli already understood that kind of pain, but about the other things, the quieter, crueler abuses. He never let me have friends, she said, her gaze distant. He said they were a bad influence. He told me I was stupid, that I could not make a decision on my own. He would hide my things, my sewing basket or a book, and then laugh when I grew frantic looking for them. He enjoyed making me feel small. He took pleasure in making me beg for a new dress, for a kind word, for him to just stop. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the warmth from the fire. The worst part was, after a while, I started to believe him. I started to believe I deserved it. Eli listened without interrupting, his own past giving him a terrible understanding. He did not offer empty platitudes or easy comfort. He simply sat with her in the dimly lit cabin and bore witness to her pain, just as she had borne witness to his. The next evening, the sky turned a bruised, ominous gray. The air grew heavy and still, the kind of oppressive quiet that comes before a storm. Eli watched Clara from the corner of his eye. She was jumpy, her hands twisting in her lap, her gaze constantly darting toward the window. The first distant rumble of thunder made her gasp. She shot to her feet, her body rigid. "It is just a storm," he said, his voice calm and low. She did not seem to hear him. As the next clap of thunder rattled the cabin, a wave of pure, animal terror washed over her face. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, her eyes wide and unseeing. The storm was not just a storm to her. It was a trigger, a key that unlocked the prison of her past. She saw her husband's face in the flashes of lightning, heard his rage in the roar of the thunder. The cabin, which had become a sanctuary, was suddenly a cage again. "I have to go," she whispered, her voice frantic. She stumbled toward the door, her bare feet clumsy on the wooden floor. "I cannot stay here." Eli was on his feet in an instant, moving to block her path. "Clara, stop! There is nowhere to go." Let me out," she cried, her voice cracking with hysteria. She tried to push past him, her hands beating weakly against his chest. She was not fighting him. She was fighting the memories that were suffocating her. He did not grab her or restrain her with force. Instead, he gathered her into his arms, pulling her trembling body against his solid frame. He picked up the rough wool blanket from his bedroll and wrapped it tightly around her, cocooning her in its warmth. "Shh," he whispered, his lips close to her ear. "You are safe. I have got you. It is only the rain. It cannot hurt you." She struggled for a moment, but his hold was firm and strangely comforting. She was hyperventilating, her small body shaking uncontrollably. He just held on, murmuring reassurances, his low voice a steady anchor in the terrifying storm inside her head. Finally, a great, shuddering sob broke from her, and she collapsed against him, clutching the front of his shirt like a lifeline. He held her until the storm of her tears passed, until her trembling subsided into a weary exhaustion, until the only sounds were the drumming of the rain on the roof and the soft, ragged rhythm of her breathing. She was asleep on her feet, her weight a dead thing in his arms. He lifted her carefully and carried her to the bed, his bed. He laid her down gently on the straw mattress, on his own pillow. She curled into a ball, clutching the blanket, her face peaceful in sleep for the first time since he had met her. He stood over her for a long time, watching the firelight play over her features. The storm outside was passing, the thunder fading into a distant grumble. A different kind of storm was brewing inside him. He looked at her, so small and vulnerable in his bed, and a fierce, protective urge rose in him, so powerful it almost stole his breath. Beneath it, another feeling stirred, a deep, lonely ache of desire. It would be so easy to lie down beside her, to feel the warmth of her body next to his, to offer and receive a different kind of comfort. He saw the faint silvery lines of old scars on her shoulder, visible in the firelight. He thought of his father's fists, of his mother's tears, of the violence he himself was capable of. He thought of Clara, clutching him like a lifeline. Trust was a fragile, precious thing, and she had just given him a piece of hers, with a resolve that cost him more than he would ever admit. He turned away. He pulled the uncomfortable wooden chair from the table, dragged it to the far side of the room, and sat down. He settled in for a long, cold watch, the sleeping woman in his bed a testament to a promise he had made to himself long ago. Sometime in the deep, quiet hours before dawn, Clara stirred. The storm had passed. The cabin was silent save for the soft crackle of the dying embers in the hearth. She felt a strange sense of peace, of safety. She opened her eyes and saw the dark shape of Eli, slumped in the chair across the room, his head resting against the log wall, fast asleep. She took in the scene. She was in his bed, wrapped in his blanket. While he kept a lonely vigil in the cold, he had held her, comforted her, and then he had walked away. He had given her a gift more valuable than any other. She sat up, the blanket pooling around her waist. "Eli," she whispered into the darkness. His eyes opened instantly. He had not been as deeply asleep as he appeared. She looked at him across the shadowed room, her heart full of a feeling she could not name. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but clear, "for not touching me." A faint smile touched his lips in the darkness. He gave a slight nod, accepting her gratitude for the restraint it had cost him so dearly. And in that quiet moment of understanding, something new and profound and terrifyingly hopeful took root between them. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm, like the slow, steady breathing of the land itself. The harshness of early spring softened into the green promise of summer. The mud dried, and the prairie grasses grew tall, whispering in the constant wind. Inside the small cabin, another kind of season was turning. The silence between Eli and Clara was no longer a void of trauma, but a space of quiet companionship. Routine became their language. In the pale light of dawn, she would rise and feed the handful of chickens that scratched in the dirt behind the cabin, her movements becoming less stiff, more certain. He would watch her from the barn door, the sight of her small figure moving against the vast, empty landscape stirring something protective and tender in his chest. He, in turn, began to teach her the ways of his world. He showed her how to read the sky for weather, how to tell good grazing grass from bad. He taught her how to groom Gideon, her touch on the big horse's flank hesitant at first, then firm and confident. One afternoon, he decided it was time she'd learn to saddle a horse properly. His hands would guide hers, showing her how to tighten the cinch, how to adjust the stirrups. His voice was a low murmur at her ear, patient and steady. She was acutely aware of his closeness, the warmth of his body, the scent of leather and dust that clung to him. She learned to stand her ground, to not flinch from his proximity, to accept his instruction as just that. They were a man and a woman living in a fragile truce with the past and a cautious curiosity about the future. Laughter, when it finally came again, arrived on the back of a simple accident. They were inside, the evening meal simmering on the hearth. A cool breeze blew through the open door, a welcome relief from the day's heat. Eli was telling her a story about a stubborn calf, and she was listening, a small, genuine smile on her face. When she reached for an egg from the bowl on the table, her fingers fumbled, and the egg slipped, falling to the floor with a sad, splattering sound. For a moment, the old Clara flickered in her eyes, the woman who would have braced for a sharp word, a look of disgust. But Eli just looked at the yellow and white mess on the floorboards and chuckled. That one had escape on its mind, he said. She looked at him, and the sight of his wry smile was so unexpected, so disarming, that a real laugh escaped her. It was the sound he remembered from the day she had thrown the skillet, clearer this time, less breathless. He knelt to clean up the mess, and she knelt beside him, a piece of cloth in her hand. As she wiped at the sticky yolk, her hand brushed against his. It was nothing, a fleeting touch of skin against skin. But this time, it was different. Neither of them pulled away. His fingers lingered against hers for a fraction of a second too long. A silent question. She looked up, her eyes meeting his over the broken egg, and she did not look away. The air grew still, charged with a sudden, potent awareness. The smile faded from her lips, replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. He read the moment, or thought he did. He saw the absence of fear in her eyes and mistook it for an invitation. Slowly, he reached up, his calloused hand infinitely gentle, and tucked a stray strand of dark hair behind her ear. His thumb grazed the soft skin of her cheek. It was as if he had thrown a switch. The light in her eyes went out. Her entire body went rigid, a statue of sudden, defensive ice. She did not pull back physically, but her spirit retreated so far and so fast that he felt the coldness of it. The fragile connection was severed. He snatched his hand back as if her skin had burned him. The silence that rushed into the space between them was heavy and suffocating. He had trespassed. He had pushed too far, too fast, and shattered the delicate trust they had so patiently built. He opened his mouth to apologize, to say anything, but she spoke first, her voice low and tight. "Do not be kind unless you mean it." He frowned, confused. "I do mean it." "What do you mean, Eli?" she pressed, her gaze sharp, cutting. "Do you mean to be kind the way a man is kind to a stray dog he has taken in? Is this pity? Or do you mean something else by it?" She was demanding the truth, and he was a man who had little experience with anything else. He looked at her, at the proud, defiant tilt of her chin, at the fear she was trying so hard to hide in the depths of her blue eyes. He owed her the honesty she was asking for. "I want you, Clara," he said, the words simple, direct, and stripped of all artifice. They fell into the quiet room with the weight of stones. "I have from the beginning, but I will not take anything from you that you do not offer. You would have to ask me, plain and clear." He had laid his own vulnerability at her feet. He had given her all the power, the very thing that had been stolen from her for so long. He watched her absorb his words, watched the flicker of understanding, of fear, of a strange, sorrowful relief in her expression. Her shoulders slumped slightly, the fight going out of her. She looked down at her hands, at the cloth still stained with egg yolk. "Then I might never ask," she whispered, the words barely audible. It was not a rejection, but a confession of a fear so deep it had become a part of her. She was admitting that the part of her that knew how to want, how to ask, how to trust and desire, was broken, and she did not know if it could ever be fixed. The line was drawn. He wanted her. She was too afraid to want him back. The knowledge settled between them, a painful, unbreachable fact. The days that followed were strained. The easy companionship was gone, replaced by a careful, deliberate distance. They were polite, they were cordial, but they were once again two strangers sharing a roof. The unspoken desire was a third presence in the small cabin, a ghost that sat at their table and watched them from the shadows. To escape the oppressive atmosphere, Clara threw herself into the ranch work with a frantic energy. She mucked out stalls, hauled water, and repaired chicken coops until her muscles ached and her hands were raw. The physical exhaustion was a welcome anesthetic for her tormented heart. One hot, still afternoon, Eli was resetting posts at the far end of the pasture, and she was tasked with checking the line of barbed wire fence that ran along the ridge. It was grueling work, the sun beating down on her back. The wire was old and rusted, sagging in places, snapped in others. She worked methodically, her mind blessedly blank, focused only on the repetitive task of stretching and securing the sharp wire. She was reaching to pull a stray length of it from a tangle of sagebrush when her boot slipped on a patch of loose shale. Her body twisted as she fell, a small, sharp cry escaping her lips as her left leg swung sideways, directly into the sagging line of wire she had been trying to fix. The pain was immediate and blinding. It was not a clean cut, but a deep, vicious tear. The barbs, sharp and rusty, ripped through the fabric of her dress and sank deep into the flesh of her upper thigh. She cried out again, a gasp of shock and agony, and scrambled away from the wire, her hands coming up to clutch at the wound. Blood, shockingly bright against the dust on her skin, welled up instantly, soaking the pale calico of her dress in a rapidly spreading stain of crimson. Eli heard her cry. He dropped his tools and ran, his long strides eating up the distance between them. He saw her on the ground, huddled and pale, her hands covered in blood. "Clara!" He reached her side in seconds, his eyes taking in the torn dress, the blood, the jagged, ugly wound beneath. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him, but he forced it down. He ripped a long strip of cloth from the bottom of his own shirt and knelt beside her, his movements swift and sure. "It is deep," he said, his voice tight with concern as he wrapped the makeshift bandage around her thigh, trying to staunch the bleeding. "We have to get you back to the cabin." She was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, her face white with shock. She tried to get to her feet, but her leg buckled beneath her, and she would have fallen if he had not caught her. Without another word, he scooped her up into his arms. Her head fell against his shoulder, her body trembling. He carried her back across the pasture, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It was a grim echo of the first time he had carried her, another journey with her broken, bleeding body in his arms. He laid her on the bed, her breathing still shallow and fast. "I have to see it," he said, his voice strained. "I have to cut the dress away." She nodded, her eyes squeezed shut against the waves of pain. He took his knife from his belt and carefully sliced through the blood-soaked fabric, laying the wound bare. It was worse than he thought. A deep, ragged gash several inches long, already swelling and angry-looking. The sight of it made his stomach clench. He moved to the wash basin, his hands shaking slightly as he poured water into a bowl. When he turned back to her, her eyes were open. They were glistening with unshed tears of pain, but her gaze was lucid and frighteningly intense. He paused, the wet cloth in his hand. "Do not look away this time," she said, her voice a raw, trembling whisper. He understood. The last time, he had tended to her wounds, but he had kept his own heart guarded, his own emotions locked away. He had offered care, but not himself. She was asking for more now. She was asking for all of it. "I will not," he promised, his voice thick. He knelt by the bed and began to clean the wound. The warm water stung, and she hissed in a sharp breath, her fingers digging into the blanket. His touch was as gentle as he could make it, but his hands were shaking. This was not like before. The clinical detachment he had managed to maintain was gone, burned away by the confession that still hung in the air between them. Every touch was charged. Every glance was loaded. The line between tending to her body and desiring it was impossibly thin. The air in the cabin grew thick, electric with a tension that was almost unbearable. He could feel the heat of her skin, smell the scent of blood and her own unique fragrance, a mixture of soap and sun and woman. He worked slowly, wiping away the blood. His gaze locked with hers. He saw the pain there, but he also saw the raw, terrifying honesty of her own want. It was a mirror of the hunger clawing at his own gut. When the wound was clean, he reached for the salve and the bandages. As he leaned over her to wrap the clean linen around her thigh, she moved. It was a small motion, just a slight shifting of her body, a leaning into his space, but it was a clear and undeniable invitation. Her eyes, dark with pain and desire, held his. It was the answer to the question he had asked days ago. She was asking him, plain and clear. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to close the small distance between them, to meet her lips with his, to lose himself in the release they both so desperately craved. But he pulled back. He physically recoiled, shifting his weight and stepping away from the bed, leaving her leaning into an empty space. A look of stunned, profound hurt flashed across her face, so raw it was like a physical blow. "You do not have to protect me from yourself," she whispered, her voice breaking, misunderstanding his retreat as an act of noble restraint. He stood by the hearth, his back to her, his hands clenched into fists. He could not look at her, could not explain the war that was raging inside him. It was not her he was protecting. "But I still need to protect me," he thought, the words a silent, desperate cry in his own mind. He was protecting himself from the hope she represented, from the terrifying possibility of a future that was not solitary, from the ghost of a past where his actions had brought ruin to someone he cared for. Loving her felt like a risk he was not brave enough to take. He finished bandaging her leg in a tense, methodical silence, his movements brisk and impersonal. He did not look at her again. As soon as he was done, he turned and walked out of the cabin, leaving her alone in the sudden, crushing quiet. Outside, the world was a blur of hazy afternoon light. He stalked to the barn, a blind, choking frustration building in his chest. He reached the solid corner post, the wood weathered and rough beneath his knuckles, and he slammed his fist into it with all his strength. A sharp, searing pain shot up his arm, and he cried out, a raw, ragged sound of pure anguish. The physical pain was a relief, a clean and simple thing compared to the tangled, impossible knot of his heart. Inside, Clara lay on the bed, reeling from his rejection. The pain in her leg was a dull throb, nothing compared to the sharp, piercing agony in her soul. With a monumental effort, she pushed herself up, her new wound screaming in protest. She hobbled to the small, cracked piece of mirror that hung by the wash basin, holding onto the table for support. She stared at her own reflection. She saw a woman with wild, haunted eyes and a pale, tear-streaked face. She saw the new white bandage stark against the skin of her thigh. She saw the old, faded scars that littered her body like a map of sorrows. She saw a woman who had finally found the courage to ask for what she wanted, only to be denied. A stranger looked back at her, a creature of fear and longing and broken pieces, hating her scars, hating her fear, hating the desperate, hungry need that still pulsed within her. She covered her face with her hands and broke down, her body shaking with sobs that made no sound. The silence that descended upon the cabin in the following days was of a different sort. It was not the quiet of companionship, but the brittle, cold silence of a fractured thing. Eli and Clara moved around the small space with a deliberate, painful courtesy, their words limited to the necessities of cohabitation. "The coffee is hot," I will be in the north pasture. Your leg, is it healing? Each sentence was a carefully placed stone, building the wall between them higher. Clara's thigh was mending, the angry gash slowly closing, but the wound his rejection had inflicted remained raw and open. Eli was a man haunted. He worked from sunup to sundown, trying to exhaust the turmoil from his body. But it was no use. At night, he would lie on his furs by the fire, staring into the embers. The image of her hurt, shocked face burned into his mind. He had done the right thing, the only thing he knew how to do to keep her safe from the wreckage of his past, but it felt like the cruelest act of his life. Clara, in turn, retreated into herself. She felt foolish, shamed by the courageous offering he had so completely refused. She needed to understand the reason, not just for the rejection, but for the man himself. He was a puzzle of contradictions, a gentle caregiver with a capacity for cold distance, a quiet man filled with a silent, violent sorrow. One afternoon, while he was out checking his traps along the creek, she was changing the dressing on her leg. The supply of clean linen in the main chest was running low. She remembered him mentioning he kept more in the small set of drawers that served as his wardrobe. She opened the top drawer, her movements hesitant. It felt like a violation of his privacy, but the need for a clean bandage was real. Inside, beneath a stack of neatly folded shirts, her fingers brushed against something hard and crinkled. It was a small packet of letters, tied with a faded piece of twine. Her heart gave a guilty lurch, but a force stronger than reason compelled her. She untied the twine. Most were old letters from his mother. The script faded and looping, but at the bottom was something different. It was several sheets of his own, the paper worn and soft at the creases, torn nearly in two and then pressed flat again. The handwriting was his, but it was a wild, desperate version of the steady script she knew. Words were scratched out so fiercely the paper was ripped. At the top of the first page, one word was legible: Anna. She knew she should not read it. It was his, a piece of a past he had never offered her. But she could not stop herself. She read the torn, unsent pages, and the story of his sorrow unfolded in a torrent of guilt and self-loathing. It was a letter of apology, a desperate plea for a forgiveness he knew he could never receive. It spoke of a terrible mistake, of whiskey and pride, of a life lost, and of a love that had turned to ash in his mouth. She was sitting at the table, the letter resting on the wood in front of her. When he came home, he stopped dead in the doorway, his eyes falling on the torn pages. Then, lifting to her face, the color drained from his cheeks. The fortress he had built around his heart had been breached, and he looked for a moment like a man facing a firing squad. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I was looking for linen," she said, her own voice steady. Though her heart was hammering, she would not be intimidated. Not anymore. She pushed the letter across the table toward him. "Who is Anna?" He stared at the letter as if it were a venomous snake. He did not move to touch it. "That is none of your concern." "I think it is," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You hide in this cabin, in this life, drowning in whatever is in that letter. You look at me with pity and with something else, and then you turn away. You push me away because of her, so I think it is my concern. I deserve to know what ghost I am fighting." He finally moved. Crossing the room in 2 long strides, he snatched the letter from the table and crushed it in his fist. "You deserve nothing," he snarled, his face a mask of anguish and fury. "You know nothing about it." "Then tell me," she cried, standing to face him. The dam inside him finally broke. The story came pouring out, ragged and choked with a decade of unshed grief. Anna was the woman he was meant to marry. Her brother, Jacob, had been his closest friend. They had grown up together, but there was a rivalry between them, a current of pride and competition that ran beneath the friendship. One night in a saloon, drunk on whiskey and their own foolishness, An old argument had resurfaced. It had escalated from harsh words to shoves. Jacob had drawn a pistol, more to make a point than to use it. Eli had grappled with him, trying to get the gun away. "It went off," he said, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. He stared at the wall, seeing it all again. "I did not mean for it to. The shot, it hit him in the leg. He lived, but Anna, she was there. She saw it, the shock of it. She was with child." His voice broke. "The shock sent her into an early labor. The doctor said she was too weak. Neither she nor the baby made it through the night." He finally looked at Clara, his eyes hollowed out by the memory. "So you see, I do not just carry the guilt of hurting my friend. I carry her. I carry the death of my own child. That is the ghost, and it is a hell of a lot bigger than you." The confession was devastating, the pain in the room so thick it was hard to breathe. Clara felt a wave of sorrow for him, for the young man he must have been, for the terrible weight he had carried alone for so long. But as she looked at him, standing there in his self-imposed prison of guilt, another feeling rose alongside the pity: anger. "So that is it?" she asked, her voice quiet but sharp. "One mistake, one terrible, tragic mistake, and you sentence yourself to this? You hide out here on this mountain and let your life rot away around you because you do not think you deserve one." "It is what I deserve," he said flatly. "No," she shot back, her anger flaring. "It is what is easy. It is easy to hide behind your guilt. It is a fortress. Just like you said, you can sit inside it and feel sorry for yourself. And you never have to risk anything again. You never have to risk caring about someone, because you can just tell yourself you are poison. You use that pain to push me away." His head snapped up, his own pain making him cruel. "And what about you?" he spat, his voice dripping with a sudden, cold fury. "You think you are any different? You are not hiding? You let me see the scars on your back, but you do not let anyone see the ones on your soul. You wrap yourself up in what that bastard Thomas did to you like it is a royal shroud, and you dare anyone to get close enough to see the real you underneath. You use your pain as a shield to keep the entire world at bay." The truth in his words struck her with the force of a physical blow. They stood there, chests heaving, in the ruins of their own making. They had torn each other open, exposing the raw, ugly truths they both tried so hard to conceal. He was hiding behind his guilt. She was hiding behind her victimhood. They were two sides of the same tarnished coin. The silence that followed was absolute, a dead space where nothing could grow. Finally, without another word, Clara turned. She walked to the bed, her movement stiff, and pulled the top wool blanket from it. She did not look at him as she walked to the door, opened it, and stepped outside. He watched her go, a muscle twitching in his jaw, but he did not say a word to stop her. She crossed the yard, her silhouette small against the vast, indifferent twilight, and disappeared into the cavernous darkness of the barn. The barn smelled of dry hay, old leather, and the warm, living scent of the animals. It was a place of simple, uncomplicated life, and for tonight, it felt safer than the cabin. She climbed the ladder to the hayloft, the familiar ache in her leg a dull counterpoint to the sharp agony in her heart. She burrowed into the hay, pulling the rough blanket around her shoulders. She did not cry at first. She was too empty. She lay there, listening to the soft sounds of the animals below, and stared into the darkness, his words echoing in her mind. "You use your pain as a shield." He was right, and the knowledge was a colder, lonelier companion than she had ever known. She must have slept, a shallow, troubled doze, because she was jolted awake by a sound that did not belong. It was a frenzy of panicked squawking and feathers, a high, terrified screaming from the chicken coop that was built against the barn's side. The sound was followed by a low, guttural snarl, a predator. Her first instinct was to hide, to pull the hay over her head and wait for it to be over. That is what the old Clara would have done. But Eli's accusation still rang in her ears. A shield. A wave of fierce, defiant anger surged through her. She was through with hiding. She scrambled down the ladder, her heart pounding. Her eyes swept the shadowy interior of the barn, looking for a weapon. Her hand closed around the smooth, worn wood of a pitchfork leaning against the wall. It was heavy and unwieldy, but it was something. Taking a deep breath, she unlatched the heavy side door and slipped out into the moonless night. The chaos at the coop was a whirlwind of violence. The wooden door was splintered, and through the opening she could see a sleek, powerful shape. A mountain cat, its back arched over a flurry of white feathers. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood. Without allowing herself to think, she let out a raw, guttural scream and charged, leveling the pitchfork like a lance. The cat was startled, its head snapping up, its eyes glowing a terrifying, demonic green in the darkness. It snarled, a sound that vibrated deep in her bones. She jabbed forward with the pitchfork, driven by a fury that was born of more than just a desire to save the chickens. She was fighting for her own life, the one she had refused to live. The cat swiped at her, its claws extended, and a searing, white-hot pain tore across her shoulder and chest as the claws ripped through her nightshirt and skin. She screamed again, this time in pain, but she did not retreat. She jabbed again, and this time the tines of the pitchfork connected with the animal's flank. It let out a yowl of pain and fury, and with a final, contemptuous snarl, it bounded away, disappearing into the darkness as silently as it had arrived. She stood there, trembling, in the middle of the carnage. The ground was littered with the bodies of dead and dying chickens. Her nightshirt was soaked with blood, her own this time. The pitchfork was heavy in her hands. She did not feel the pain of her wounds, only a strange, wild sense of clarity. The sound of the cabin door banging open and the thunder of running footsteps finally registered. Eli appeared out of the darkness, his rifle held at the ready. He took in the scene in an instant. The broken coop, the dead birds, and Clara, standing there, bloodied and trembling, but upright. He lowered the rifle. His eyes met hers across the small, ruined space. He saw the new wounds, the deep, bleeding scratches that ran from her shoulder down her chest. He saw the defiance and the exhaustion in her gaze. All the anger, all the arguments, all the ghosts of the past were incinerated in that single, silent look. He walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not speak. There were no words for what he felt. He gently took the pitchfork from her unresisting hands and let it fall to the ground. Then, with an infinite, aching tenderness, he lifted her into his arms and carried her back to the house. He set her down on the edge of the bed, the flickering lamplight casting long shadows across the room. He knelt before her and, with his knife, began to cut away the tattered, bloody remnants of her nightshirt. This time, there was no resistance, no hesitation, no fear. Their eyes stayed locked, and a deep, shuddering tremor ran through her entire body. It was not a tremor of fear. It was the shaking of a building surrendering its foundations, the tremor of release. He exposed the wounds, 3 deep, parallel gashes, raw and bleeding, that started at her collarbone and curved down the side of her breast. He took a clean cloth and dipped it in the water bowl, his movements full of a reverence that bordered on worship. He began to wash the blood away. His touch was no longer just gentle. It was a prayer. He was washing away more than the night's blood. He was cleansing the wounds they had inflicted on each other, the scars left by Thomas, the ghost of Anna. He was tending to her soul. She watched his face, saw the tears tracking silently through the dust on his cheeks. She saw the years of guilt and loneliness being washed away with her own blood. When he had finished, when the wounds were clean, she slowly lifted her hands, her fingers trembling, and cupped his face. She drew him forward. She kissed him. It was a soft, desperate kiss, full of all the sorrow and longing that had no words. It was a kiss of forgiveness, of acceptance, of a shared and profound brokenness. He responded, his arms coming around her, holding her gently, pulling her into an embrace that was both a shield and a surrender. And then they were both crying, great, silent, racking sobs that shook their bodies. They clung to each other, two survivors in a sea of grief, finally allowing the storm to break. Outside, the rain began to fall, a soft, steady drumming on the roof. The tears subsided, leaving behind a deep and profound exhaustion. He laid her back on the bed and pulled the blankets over her body before lying down beside her, on top of the covers. He did not touch her again, but his presence was a solid, comforting weight. There was no passion. Not in that moment. There was something deeper, something more essential. It was the quiet, peaceful intimacy of two souls who had walked through fire and found a safe harbor. At last, in each other, and for the first time, in the quiet dark of the cabin, with the sound of the rain washing the world clean, they slept together. Clara woke to the pale, milky light of dawn filtering through the cabin's single window. For a long moment, she lay perfectly still, her body a geography of aches, the sharp pull of the new scratches on her shoulder, the dull throb in her thigh, the old, familiar soreness deep in her bones. But beneath it all was a profound, unprecedented stillness in her soul. She was not alone. She turned her head slowly on the pillow. Eli was asleep beside her, lying on his back on top of the covers, one arm flung over his eyes to block the morning light. His chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm, in sleep. The harsh, guarded lines of his face were softened, and he looked younger, more vulnerable. The darkness that usually clung to him like a shroud had receded. They had not touched again after he had laid her down, but his presence through the night had been a constant, reassuring warmth, a bulwark against the darkness. Quietly, she slipped out of the bed. The cool air touched her skin, and she pulled the blanket from the bed around her shoulders, covering the thin nightshirt she had found and put on after he had cleaned her wounds. She moved to the hearth and added a log to the glowing embers, coaxing them back to life. The familiar, mundane act felt different this morning, charged with a new significance. Everything felt different. The sound of her movements woke him. He sat up in a single, fluid motion, instantly awake and alert. His eyes found her across the room, and a flicker of something, apprehension, uncertainty, crossed his face. He was watching her, she realized, searching her expression for the shape of regret. The new, fragile ground they stood on felt perilously thin, as if a single wrong word could send them plunging back into the chasm of their separate sorrows. He swung his legs off the bed, his movements tentative. He looked from her to the empty space beside him on the mattress, as if unsure of what had transpired, of what it all meant. The air was thick with questions he did not know how to ask. Clara clutched the blanket tighter. She could feel him waiting for her to retreat, to build the walls back up, to pretend the raw, desperate honesty of the previous night had been nothing more than a fever dream born of pain and fear. The thought was unbearable. They had come too far to go back. She met his gaze, her own clear and unwavering. "Do not pretend it did not mean something," she said, her voice quiet but firm in the morning stillness. The tension in his shoulders eased. A slow, deep breath escaped his lips. He gave a single, solemn nod. It was not a grand declaration, but it was enough. It was an acknowledgement, a promise. What had passed between them was real, and they would not dishonor it with denial. The morning unfolded in this new, shy quiet. He made coffee while she cooked bacon, their movements a clumsy but companionable dance in the small space. They were acutely aware of each other, of the slight brush of his arm against hers as he reached for the kettle, of the way her hair caught the light when she turned from the fire. It was the beginning of a language they had yet to learn, a conversation spoken in glances and gestures. The knock on the door came like a gunshot. It was sharp, loud, and official. Both of them froze. No one ever came to Eli's cabin. He moved to the door, his body instantly shifting into a guarded, defensive posture. Clara felt a familiar, cold dread snake its way up her spine. He opened the door a crack. On the porch stood Sheriff Miller, his face grim, his badge glinting dully in the morning sun. Beside him stood a younger, harder-faced man she did not recognize. "Eli," the sheriff said, his voice stripped of any warmth. "I need a word with the woman." Eli did not move. He blocked the doorway with his body. "She is not fit for visitors." "This is not a social call," Sheriff Miller said, his gaze flicking past Eli to where Clara stood frozen by the hearth. "Thomas Murphy's family sent for the county marshal. They have reopened the inquiry into his death. They claim there was foul play." The younger man beside him smirked, a cruel, knowing look that made Clara's blood run cold. He had the same pale, calculating eyes as her late husband. "A cousin," she realized with a sickening lurch. "That is ridiculous," Eli said, his voice a low growl. "The man was drunk and fell in a well. Your own report said so." "My report is now in question," the sheriff said, his tone weary but firm. "I have a duty to investigate. Now step aside." There was no arguing. Eli stepped back, a look of grim fury on his face, and the two men entered the cabin. The small room suddenly felt crowded, suffocating. The man who was Thomas's cousin let his eyes roam over the cabin's interior, over the single bed, his smirk deepening with insinuation. The sheriff turned his attention to Clara. His questions were a barrage of blunt, brutal inquiries. Where was she the night Thomas died? Why did she run? Who saw her leave? Who saw her return? Each question was a shovel, digging up the horrors she had tried so hard to bury. She answered in a small, tight voice, her hands twisting in the folds of the blanket. She could feel the cousin's eyes on her, stripping her bare, judging her, condemning her. "She was found half dead by the river," Eli cut in, his voice sharp with anger. "Look at her. Does she look like a woman capable of murdering a man twice her size?" "Desperate people are capable of a great many things," the cousin said, his voice a smug drawl. "Especially a woman who stands to inherit her husband's property, a woman who was seen taking up with another man no sooner than her husband was in the ground." The accusation, vile and ugly, hung in the air. Clara felt as if she had been slapped. She saw the flash of murder in Eli's eyes. He took a step toward the man, his hands clenched into fists. "That is enough," the sheriff said, putting a hand on Eli's chest. "This is an official inquiry. You will not interfere." He turned back to Clara. "Ma'am, given the new accusations, I am going to have to ask you to come back to Redemption with me for a more formal questioning." The words were a death sentence. To be taken back to that town, to be paraded through the streets, to be locked in a cell and subjected to the sneers and whispers and endless, humiliating questions. It was more than she could bear. The walls of the cabin began to close in, her breath catching in her throat. "You cannot," Eli said, his voice dangerously low. "She is unwell. She is under my care." "And what is your relation to this woman, Eli?" the sheriff asked, his eyes hard. "She has been living here, in your home. Are you her keeper, her family?" The question cornered him. He was nothing to her, not in the eyes of the law. He had no right to protect her, no standing to keep her from their clutches. Clara saw the helpless fury in his face, the realization that his strength, his will, was useless against the cold, impartial machinery of the law. They could take her, and there was not a thing he could do to stop them. The sheriff gave them an hour to prepare. As soon as the door closed behind the two men, leaving them in a stunned, ringing silence, the fragile peace of the morning was shattered. Clara sank into a chair, her body trembling. They were going to destroy her, the life she was just beginning to imagine. The fragile sprout of hope that had taken root in her heart was about to be ripped out and trampled into the dust. Eli paced the small floor like a caged animal, his mind racing, searching for a way out, a loophole, an escape. There was none. She was a lone woman, an outcast, accused of a terrible crime. He was a solitary rancher with a dark past of his own. His word meant nothing against the accusations of a grieving, influential family. He stopped in front of her, his face a mask of desperation. "There is one way," he said, his voice rough. "One way I can stop them from taking you." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a sliver of hope. "If you were my wife," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "If we were married, they could not force you to testify. As your husband, I could speak for you. Your reputation would be under the protection of my name. They would have to leave you be." The hope in her chest turned to ice. A wife, his wife. Not because he loved her, not because he wanted her, but for legal protection. It was a transaction, a shield. She would go from being one man's property to another's. It was a marriage of pity. The silence stretched, thick and painful. He was offering her a lifeline, and it felt like a chain. "I do not want your pity," she said, her voice a raw whisper. The words were a rending cry from the deepest part of her soul, from the woman who had been a burden, an obligation, a charity case for her entire life. She stood up, her small frame filled with a sudden, fierce pride. She looked him straight in the eye, her own gaze stripped bare of all artifice. "I do not want your protection if it is just a duty. I do not want your name if it does not come with your respect. I have had a life without love. Eli, I will not sign up for another." She took a breath and laid her heart at his feet. "I do not want your pity," she repeated, her voice shaking but clear. "I want your heart." He stared at her as if she had struck him. He saw not the victim, not the broken woman he had rescued, but a queen in rags, proud and magnificent in her vulnerability. She was demanding not just his help, but his truth. She was asking for the one thing he had kept locked away for a decade, the one thing he believed was forfeit. And in that moment, faced with the prospect of losing her to the wolves, he finally understood. His fortress of guilt was not a prison, it was a tomb, and she was the only thing that had ever made him want to feel the sun again. The fight went out of him, replaced by a stunning, terrifying, beautiful clarity. "You already have it," he confessed, his voice thick with a decade of unshed emotion. "Clara, you have had it for longer than I have been willing to admit." Tears welled in her eyes, hot and immediate. But these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a profound, earth-shattering relief. He stepped forward, and for the first time, he initiated a touch that was not born of necessity or comfort. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "Marry me," he said, and this time, it was not an offer, but a plea. "Be my wife." She leaned into his touch, a soft, broken sound escaping her lips. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." When Sheriff Miller returned, Eli met him at the door. "You will not be taking her," he said, his voice calm and resolute. "Clara has agreed to become my wife. The ceremony will take place today. You are welcome to stay and witness it, if you doubt my word." The sheriff and the cousin were stunned into silence. A marriage, conducted so hastily, was a clear and public declaration. It bound Clara to Eli, placing her firmly under his protection. Legally. Their hands were tied, at least for the moment, with a look of pure, thwarted malice. The cousin turned and stalked away. Sheriff Miller lingered for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You are taking on a heavy burden, Eli," he said quietly. "She is not a burden," Eli replied, his gaze finding Clara's over the sheriff's shoulder. "She is my wife." They were married by the river. It was the only place that felt right. The water, which had almost claimed her life, now bore witness to its new beginning. There was no preacher, no guests, just the two of them under the vast, silent sky. The sun was warm on their faces, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the cottonwood trees. Clara wore the same faded calico dress she had worn when she fought the mountain cat, mended now and washed clean. It was all she had. Eli had taken off his hat, and his dark hair was ruffled by the wind. They stood on the bank, their hands clasped together. There were no rings, no fancy words. Their vows were the simple, unvarnished truths of their hearts. "I will not look away," he said, his voice rough with emotion as he looked into her eyes. "I will stand with you. I will honor you. I will be your husband, before God and this land, for all my days." "I will be your wife," she answered, her voice soft but clear as the river water. "I will share your home and your life. I will trust you with my heart, for all of my days." He took the red bandana from his back pocket, the one he always wore, and gently, with a reverence that made her heart ache, he draped it over her head. It was her veil, a splash of vibrant color against her dark hair, a symbol of his life, his work, now covering and protecting her. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, solemn kiss that sealed their promises. That night, back in the cabin, the world had been remade. It was no longer his home where she was a guest. It was their home. The threat from the town still lingered, a distant shadow, but inside the sturdy log walls, they were safe. A new kind of quiet settled over them, not shy this time, but rich with unspoken understanding. After a simple meal, he built up the fire. She stood by the window, watching the last purple streaks of twilight fade from the sky. He came to stand behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. She leaned back against his chest, her eyes closing. They stood like that for a long time, simply breathing together. Later, by the warm glow of the fire, they came together. It was nothing like the desperate, sorrowful kiss of the night before. This was a slow, deliberate exploration, a confident and passionate claiming. It was a reclamation of all that had been stolen from her, an awakening of all that had lain dormant in him. His hands on her body were not just gentle, they were worshipful. He kissed the scars on her shoulder, the faint, silvery lines on her back, not as wounds to be healed, but as parts of the story that had brought her to him. And she, in turn, met his hunger with her own, a fierce, untamed wanting that she had never known she possessed. It was a joining of equals, a powerful, trusting, and deeply passionate act that was not about comfort, but about celebration. They were not two broken people finding solace. They were a man and a woman, whole and alive, finally coming home. A week later, they rode into redemption. It was a deliberate act, a statement. Clara sat tall on Gideon, a new, sturdy dress on her back that Eli had ordered from a catalog. She was no longer a frightened wraith. She was Mrs. Eli Vance. He tethered the horse in front of the general store, and they walked toward the door. As he reached for the handle, he paused and held out his hand to her. She took it, her smaller hand enfolded in his strong, calloused one. Together, they walked inside. The store fell silent. The whispers started almost immediately. A rustle of speculation and judgment. Mr. Abernathy stood behind the counter, his expression carefully neutral. But his wife, a woman whose face was a permanent mask of sour disapproval, was not so circumspect. As Clara passed the fabric aisle, "Mrs." Abernathy muttered to a friend, just loud enough to be heard, "It is a scandal, is what it is. She does not deserve a decent man like him." The old Clara would have flinched, would have hurried away, her face burning with shame. The new Clara stopped. She turned, her chin held high, and looked the woman directly in the eye. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the silence of the store with the clean, sharp edge of steel. "Then maybe," she said, her gaze unwavering, "he deserves me." A slow, proud smile spread across Eli's face. He squeezed her hand, a silent signal of his pride, his love, his unwavering support. They had faced the town, and they had won. Not by fighting, but by refusing to be ashamed. He turned to the counter to place their order, his wife standing tall and unshakable by his side. Their marriage was a quiet fortress against the world. But the world was not so easily deterred. The fragile peace they had built lasted less than a month. A circuit judge, a man with a reputation for severity, was making his rounds. And Thomas Murphy's family had his ear. The case was officially escalated. Clara Vance was summoned to stand trial for the murder of her husband. The news arrived in the form of a subpoena delivered by a grim-faced deputy, and it fell upon their small cabin like an axe. All the old fears came rushing back, threatening to drown Clara in a tide of helpless terror. But this time, she was not alone. The night the summons came, Eli held her as she trembled, not with empty reassurances, but with a quiet, unshakable resolve. "They want a story," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "We will give them the truth, the whole truth." The next morning, before the sun had even crested the eastern ridges, he was gone. He left her with a week's worth of firewood, a loaded rifle by the door, and a promise in his eyes that was more binding than any vow. He rode east, away from redemption, chasing the ghosts of her past. He knew the town's prejudice was a wall he could not break with his fists or his own testimony. He needed other voices, other truths to stand alongside hers. His quest took him across 2 counties, through dusty settlements and isolated homesteads. He was searching for the people who had existed on the periphery of Clara's married life, the ones who had seen the bruises she tried to hide, who had heard the muffled cries through thin walls. He found them, one by one. Timid souls who were afraid of the Murphy family's influence, afraid of the trouble that came from speaking out of turn. But in Eli's grim, determined face, they saw a chance for a different kind of justice. The first was a preacher in a small, clapboard church in the next valley over. Reverend Miller was a thin, nervous man with hands that fluttered like frightened birds. At first, he claimed to remember nothing, but Eli sat with him in the dusty silence of the empty church, his presence a heavy, unmoving weight, and he spoke of Clara's quiet dignity, of the scars he had seen on her soul. Finally, the preacher's conscience won out over his fear. He confessed he had seen Clara a week before Thomas's death, when she had come to ask for prayers. He had seen the dark, ugly mark on her cheek, the one she tried to hide with her bonnet. He had asked if she needed help. She had only shaken her head and said that some burdens were for a soul to bear alone. The second was a woman named Sarah, a former neighbor who had moved away after her husband's death. Eli found her living with her sister, her hands raw from laundry work. She remembered the Murphys well. She remembered the sound of breaking glass from their house at all hours of the night. She remembered seeing Clara in her garden, trying to work with an arm that she could barely lift. Sarah had once offered her a jar of preserves over the fence, and Thomas had come out and ordered Clara inside, his voice full of a cold, menacing fury. Sarah had lived in fear of him herself, and she had been relieved to move away. The last witness was the hardest to find, and the most important. His name was Josiah, a black ranch hand who had worked for Thomas for a season. Eli tracked him to a large cattle operation 50 miles to the south. Josiah was a quiet, powerful man with eyes that had seen too much of the world's casual cruelty. He was hesitant to speak, knowing his word would be weighed differently, that his involvement would put him at great risk. But he had respected Clara. He told Eli how Thomas would mock her in front of the hired hands, how he would countermand her simple orders about the kitchen garden just to humiliate her. And he told Eli about the day he had seen Thomas strike her, a hard, open-handed blow that had sent her sprawling into the dirt, simply for bringing him the wrong tool. Josiah had been dismissed the next day for no reason. He knew it was because he had been a witness. With these 3 promises secured, Eli rode back to Redemption, arriving the day before the trial was set to begin. The town was buzzing. It was the biggest spectacle they had seen in years. The courtroom, situated above the sheriff's office, was packed to the rafters with curious, hungry faces. Clara sat beside Eli at a small table at the front, her hands clenched in her lap. She felt like an insect under glass, pinned and studied by 100 hostile eyes. The prosecutor was a man named Finch, a bitter, ambitious lawyer from the county seat with a mouth that seemed permanently twisted in a sneer. He painted a picture of Clara as a cold, manipulative woman, a harlot who had tired of her husband and disposed of him to take up with a new man. A reclusive brute from the hills, he twisted her flight from home into the act of a guilty conscience. He twisted her marriage to Eli into a cynical ploy to escape justice. Then he called her to the stand. Her legs felt like water as she made her way to the witness chair. Finch's questions were like a series of deliberate, brutal cuts, each one designed to make her bleed. He made her recount the night of Thomas's death, her escape, her return. He mocked her inability to remember details, her confusion. "So you expect this court to believe," he sneered, "that after years of a supposedly unhappy marriage, your husband just happened to have a fatal accident on the very night you chose to run away like a thief in the night?" "I did not run like a thief," Clara said, her voice trembling. "I ran like a hunted animal." "An animal that was perhaps tired of its master?" Finch shot back. He pressed her, his voice dripping with insinuation, about her relationship with Eli. "How long had you known Mr. Vance before your husband's timely demise? How many times did he visit you while your husband was away on business?" "I had never met him," she cried, the injustice of it all overwhelming her. "I met him when he found me by the river, when I was dying." "A convenient story," Finch said with a dismissive wave of his hand. He continued his assault, picking at her memories, her character, her motives, until she was stripped raw. The room began to spin. The faces in the crowd blurred into a single, monstrous, judging eye. She looked at Thomas's cousin, who sat in the front row, his face a mask of smug triumph. The weight of it all, the years of abuse, the town's scorn, the prosecutor's venom, it was too much. A great, shuddering sob broke from her chest. She covered her face with her hands, not in a display of guilt, but in an act of profound, soul-deep exhaustion. She broke down, but she did not lie. Her tears were her only testimony. Finch smiled, believing he had won. But then Eli stood up. He did not have to be called. He walked to the front of the courtroom and turned to face the judge, a formidable man with a stern face and intelligent eyes. "Your Honor," Eli began, his voice shaking with a fury he was struggling to control. "My wife is not on trial for her character. She is on trial for a crime she did not commit. You want to know what happened to Thomas Murphy? You need to know the man he was." Finch objected, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand, his gaze fixed on Eli. "Let him speak." Eli's voice grew steadier, more powerful as he continued. He did not speak of his love for Clara, or of his own past. He spoke for her. He told the court about finding her, a broken thing of sticks and bones, bleeding by the river. He described the old, faded scars on her back, the way she flinched from any sudden movement, the terror in her eyes when a storm broke. His voice was unwavering, a testament of absolute conviction. "That is not the mark of a killer," he said, his voice ringing through the silent room. "That is the mark of a survivor." Then he called his witnesses, Reverend Miller, Sarah the neighbor, and Josiah the ranch hand. One by one, they took the stand, their voices quiet but firm. They spoke the truths they had held in silence for so long. They painted a devastating, undeniable picture of Thomas Murphy's cruelty and Clara's suffering. The smug expression on the cousin's face slowly curdled into a scowl. The whispers in the courtroom died away, replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable silence. When the last witness had stepped down, the judge looked at the prosecutor, then at Clara, who sat, pale and spent, at the table. He looked at Eli, who stood like a mountain behind her. He cleared his throat. "The testimony presented here today," he said, his voice filling the courtroom, "has cast more than a reasonable doubt on the accusations of foul play. It has, in fact, painted a grim picture of a life of quiet desperation." He looked directly at Thomas's cousin. "Vengeance is a bitter and unproductive pursuit. This court finds no credible evidence to hold Mrs. Vance, the case is dismissed." A collective gasp went through the room. For a moment, no one moved. Then, the judge banged his gavel, a sharp, final sound, and it was over. Clara walked out of the courtroom on Eli's arm. Free! The crowd parted for them, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and a grudging, newfound respect. She did not look at any of them. She was free, but she was exhausted, hollowed out by the ordeal. The victory did not feel triumphant. It felt like waking from a long and terrible fever. Months passed. The harsh glare of the trial slowly faded, like a scar, into the fabric of their past. The ranch, once a place of solitude and survival, slowly, surely, became a home. The rhythm of their lives was dictated by the seasons. Summer bled into a golden autumn, which gave way to the quiet, white blanket of winter, and then burst forth again in the tender green of spring. Clara found a deep and abiding peace in the simple, honest work of the land. In the spring, she turned over a patch of earth near the cabin, her hands sinking into the rich, dark soil. She planted a garden, nurturing tiny seeds into rows of sturdy green shoots. The garden became her sanctuary, a place where she could cultivate life, where her care and patience were rewarded with the simple, beautiful miracle of growth. Eli, watching her, felt the last of his own ghosts begin to recede. The restless energy that had once driven him to exhaustion was now channeled into building. He felled trees and hewed logs, and with his own hands, he built a wide porch onto the front of the cabin. It was an act of faith, a statement that their life was no longer about sheltering from the world, but about having a place to sit together, side by side, and watch it go by. In the evenings, they would sit on the new porch steps, the scent of Clara's burgeoning garden sweet on the air, and watch the sun set the western sky on fire. One evening, in the heart of their first summer as husband and wife, a profound sense of peace settled over Clara. The air was warm and thick with the scent of honeysuckle and pine. The setting sun bathed the world in a soft, golden light that made everything look new and clean. She turned to Eli, who was sitting beside her on the porch, his presence a solid, comforting warmth. She stood up and, without a word, began to unbutton her dress. He watched her, his expression questioning but not alarmed. He trusted her. The dress fell to the porch floor in a pool of calico. She stood before him in her thin chemise, the golden light tracing the lines of her body. Then, she took the straps of the chemise and pushed them off her shoulders, letting it fall to join the dress. She stood before him, her body bared to his gaze and to the setting sun. The scars were all visible now, the thin, silvery lines on her back from Thomas's belt, the puckered mark on her thigh from the barbed wire, the faint, angry scratches on her shoulder from the mountain cat. They were a map of her journey, a testament to her survival. She was not ashamed, not anymore. She looked at him, her heart in her eyes, and she spoke the words that had become their creed, their prayer. "Do not look away," she said again. Her voice was not a plea this time, not a challenge, but a soft, confident, loving invitation. He did not. He rose from the steps and came to her, his eyes full of a reverence that made her soul ache with love. He did not speak. Instead, he knelt before her. He pressed his lips to the scar on her thigh, a soft, lingering kiss. He rose, his hands tracing the faint lines on her back, his mouth following his touch. He kissed every scar, every broken place, every part of her that had ever known pain. He was not erasing her past. He was honoring it. He was loving the woman who had endured it all. When he finally lifted his head to look at her, his eyes were wet with tears. "You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He lifted her into his arms and carried her from the porch, not into the cabin, but out into the tall, sweet grass of the meadow. They made love there, under the vast, open sky, with the last rays of the sun warming their skin. It was a joining of fierce, reverent longing, a celebration of the wild, untamed beauty of their own healed and imperfect hearts. The story closes some weeks later, on a cool, clear night. A fire crackled in the hearth, a bastion of warmth and light against the darkness outside. Eli was asleep in their bed, his breathing deep and even. Clara sat at the table, a single candle burning beside her, a pen in her hand. She was writing a letter. She wrote not to a friend or family, but to the woman she used to be, the frightened, silent girl who had stared at a floral wallpaper, believing she was worthless. She told that girl about the pain, about the fear, but also about the strength she never knew she had. She told her about the kindness of a stranger, about the terror of a courtroom, and about the quiet, steady, healing power of a garden. When she was finished, she read the letter one last time, then folded it carefully. She did not need to keep it. She had lived it. She walked to the fireplace and dropped the letter into the flames. She watched as the paper blackened, curled, and turned to ash, the words dissolving into the heat and the light. The past was not gone, but it was transformed. It was fuel. I was not saved, I healed, but love lit the fire. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We would love to hear where you are tuning in from in the comments below so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with us in English.